It's 11 o'clock. Good morning, everybody. And it's a delight to see so many of you here today. I think this is sort of perfect Festival of Ideas weather. It's not so sunny that you all want to be outside, and it's not so rainy that you all stayed at home. So good to see a full turnout. My name is Paul Kizik. I am the Chief Executive, the Group Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust. An absolute delight to welcome you today to a couple of events we have marking the 100th anniversary of Joseph Rowntree's death around the theme of making waves, building on Joseph Rowntree's legacy. This is not an audience that I need to say much about to in terms of who Joseph Rowntree was, and if there is any doubt, we have tastefully decorated the Guildhall so you can find out lots more about his legacy. A couple of small announcements before we get into today's event. Firstly, we're not expecting a fire alarm test, or a fire alarm rather. If we do have one, please just follow the stewards back out that way up into St Helens Square. And if you're carrying a mobile phone, and who isn't, please put it on silent or turn it off for the duration of today's session. As I say, 2025 marks 100 years since Joseph Rowntree's death. And Joseph lived at a time of profound change, economic change, technological change, social change, political change. And looking back today, we tend to see that as a time we would describe as a time of deep transition, where particularly in the second half of his life, Joseph was involved in bits of innovation, social policy innovation in particular, which helped to pave the way towards what subsequently became the modern welfare state, whether that's about occupational pensions or whether it was building new housing for low-income workers. Today, roll forward 100 years or so, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation believes that we are at, or should be at, a period of similar transition today as we face into similarly profound economic challenges, social and political challenges, and of course in ecological challenges as well. And so today, that is the work that we do. We seek to shape and speed up the transition to that more equitable world and a new political economy. We do it in a few different ways. We seek to shift the terms of the debate, and actually, in a small way today, through a couple of panel discussions, we'll make a contribution to that debate. Secondly, we look to support and shield those people who are looking to build the new, build the future in today. So we look for pioneers around the country who, like Joseph Rowntree in his own day, were imagining different ways of living and working, and we fund and support an ecosystem of such pioneers across the country, and with a particular focus in York and our region. And thirdly, we try and build the infrastructure. We invest in what we call the infrastructure for transition. And that could be around insights, fresh insights to understand the world in which we live. It could be around building grassroots power, so that the grassroots movements that can drive meaningful social change are better equipped to do so. And it could be investing in things like imagination and hope, the sort of things which are critical ingredients to moving to a new political economy and are all too often lacking. If you want to find out more about our organisation, and I'll stop plugging our organisation now, there is information available at the back. My colleagues will be more than happy to talk a bit more about the work that we are doing. Now, about 20 years before his death, Joseph Rowntree wrote a memorandum which was to give some guidance to the organisations that would carry his name, including our own, as to the work that he wanted us to do. And whilst it's not very prescriptive, which is great, gives us a lot of freedom as the work we do, the clear message was to focus on the underlying causes of social injustice. So his main message was don't focus on what he would call the superficial manifestations. So don't run a soup kitchen. You know, that's important, running a soup kitchen, but other people will do that. What he wants our organisation to do is dig deeper into the structural drivers that cause people to need soup kitchens. What is it that really is deeply wired into our economy, into our society, that creates social injustice? And in essence, that is the driving force of what we do today. One thing he doesn't talk about, of course, in that memorandum is growth. And he certainly doesn't use the phrase gross domestic product, a concept which in its modern sense only really came into being about 10 years after he died. But growth and GDP are concepts which dominate the political debate at the moment. And indeed, our current government would say economic growth is their #1 priority. But why growth? Why not living standards? And how do those two ideas interlink? So that is the sort of question we want to get into in our first discussion today. I'm absolutely delighted to have a star-studded panel to have that conversation with. We have 4 panelists today. Ruth Curtis is the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, an independent think tank focused on improving the living standards of those on low to medium incomes. I'm going to describe Ruth still, I think, as the relatively new Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation. Absolutely delighted that Ruth has come to York in her first year in the role to join us at the festival. Until very recently, Ruth was a senior official at His Majesty's Treasury, which is where all good people come from. So before you start booing that fact. Danny Sriskandarajah, who is the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, an organisation seeking to transform the economy so it works for people and planet, igniting change from below and providing high-quality research to fight for change from the top. Danny was previously the Chief Executive of Oxfam GB and is the author of Power to the People. Heaton Shah is Chief Executive at the British Academy, the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, and amongst his extraordinary wide range of roles in social and economic policy, he's also the chair of Our World in Data, and he's very much a friend of the City of York, as is our final speaker, Rachel Maskell, who is, of course, Member of Parliament for York Central, a seat to which she was first elected in 2015. Now, in terms of format this morning, I'm going to ask each of those panelists to talk in turn to give us some insights, some reflections, some provocations on the questions around growth and living standards and who benefits. They're going to each talk for up to 10 minutes. We'll then go into a conversation, which I will lead, and then I will be looking to your good selves for some questions to put to our panelists, and then we will have it wrapped up by 12:30. So thank you very much. I'm going to now ask Ruth to kick us off from the Resolution Foundation to set the scene for our conversation. Thanks, Ruth.
Do I need to do anything to my mic? No, come on. Does that work? Can you hear me? Great. I'm going to stand up so you can see me. So thanks very much for having me in York today. As Paul says, I worked at the Treasury for a long time, over 15 years, and so it is a particular pleasure on the Friday before a spending review to be here with you rather than immersed in spreadsheets. And that means I've spent a lot of time worrying about trade-offs and all of that, and so I thought I would relax a bit today and argue that in lots of these areas I want to have my cake and eat it. But before I do that, I just want to give us a bit of context on living standards in the UK, which, as Paul says, is what we focus on in the Resolution Foundation. And I think it's worth saying that although the government's target and mission is often described as growth, one of the ways in which they've said they will measure progress against that mission is to have rising living standards or rising incomes after housing costs in this Parliament. That's a good thing to have. It's not a very ambitious thing to have. We've had that in every parliament since the mid-1950s, and I say the mid-1950s just because that's how far back we've looked at the data. So hopefully we'll not only have rising living standards in this parliament, but a bit better than that. Stepping back, in the 2020s, mean incomes are forecast to rise for that decade as a whole by about 4% or just over £1,000. If we looked at the 2010s, which you might not think of as boom times, they rose by 14% or just over nearly £3,000. If we think back to the decade between Tony Blair being elected and the financial crisis, they rose by 26% or over £5,000. So it is no wonder that the Labour Party are finding it a bit harder being in power now than it was then. Now, those are all averages, and they hide a lot about the variation in experiences between families, depending on their income, on where they live, on their characteristics. And one of the things we do at Resolution Foundation is try and look into that variation. I first started doing work like that actually in the Treasury, when the Treasury first started publishing analysis like that of budgets, and it was George Osborne who first started publishing that analysis. Why did he do that? Because he was delivering some reasonably tough stuff, and he wanted to prove this claim, often repeated, that he said that those with the broadest shoulders were bearing the greatest burden. And there was a particular chart that the Treasury publishes that shows the impact of policy decisions according to the income distribution. And effectively, policy was constrained by the need at every budget for this chart to show that cumulatively, although maybe lots of people were losing out, the higher incomes were losing more than the lower incomes. And I tell that story just because I really want to emphasize how unusual and perhaps surprising what I'm about to tell you is. So it is the case that when we think about projections for living standards, lower income households will do worse than the averages I described. So at Resolution Foundation, our analysis at the time of the spring statement was that over the next 5 years, families in the lower half, so not the poorest, the whole half of the UK earning with below average incomes would be £500 worse off over the next 5 years, not better off, worse off. But on top of that, when we look just at policy decisions, those taken so far, and some of us have some optimism for decisions in the future, but those taken so far hit the bottom half about twice as much as the top half. So we're not meeting the previous tests that I described. But that's all very gloomy, so let's cheer up a bit. There are 3 areas where very briefly I want to tell you we can have our cake and eat it. That is gross domestic product or well-being, pre-distribution or redistribution, and higher growth or lower inequality. So GDP or well-being, gross domestic product, as Paul was saying, is it a useful thing to aim for, or just a terrible, terrible proxy of the things that we actually care about living standards and well-being? And conscious there are people more expert than me on this panel on this topic, and look forward to hearing from them. But I think worth saying, why do we care about growth or GDP at all? It is basically because there is a reasonably well-established long-run relationship between productivity in the economy and living standards. There's a famous quote from Paul Krugman which says that productivity is not everything in the long run for living standards, but it is almost everything. And at Resolution Foundation, we've looked at that in the UK, and it does basically hold true as a relationship over decades. There are 2 important challenges to that view. One is that some people think this has broken down in recent years, particularly based on evidence in the US, but also some other advanced economies. 2 things I would say about that. First, we've delved into that in detail at Resolution Foundation in the UK, and although there is superficially some decoupling of that relationship, it's for reasons, to give you an example, like higher pension contributions that don't really suggest a structural decoupling between that relationship. So in our view, it remains an important relationship. And then secondly, although it's clear that there have been economies in the world where we've had higher productivity and higher growth without improved living standards, that shouldn't lead us to conclude that we can have higher living standards without higher growth. So growth, we think, remains important. The second counter-argument is that measures of GDP are a bit rubbish, and they certainly are. If you want to know more about that, highly recommend Diane Coyle's new book, which if you read, you will basically ignore the GDP statistics whenever they come out, which might also be good for your well-being. But it's very, very hard to measure. And Diane has lots of great reasons for that. But despite all of those challenges, I would love to be in a world where what we had was this boom in living standards and well-being, but this mismeasured growth where it didn't show up. And if that was the problem, we could all have a really long session about measurement challenges in GDP. But unfortunately, they're both rubbish, and so I think we need to worry about both of them. Secondly, I was going to talk about pre-distribution or redistribution, which is a very policy wonkish phrase, so let me unpack it a bit. Pre-distribution, as some of you may know, is the idea that we need to change the structure of the economy so that before incomes and wages reach people, they're more fairly distributed. Redistribution is the idea that people get the income that they get, and then we redistribute it through the tax and welfare system. And again, I think we shouldn't be posed as alternatives. We need to have both of these. So growth is important, but it is not, we shouldn't aim for growth and then cross our fingers that we will get shared prosperity. We will need both pre-distribution and redistribution as well. And just to show you that growth alone is not enough, it's important to think about what happens when wages rise and what happens when costs rise. So looking at households in the UK, if you think about the poorest fifth of households in the UK, they get just over half of their income from wages. If you look at the richest half, it's almost 94%. So basically almost all of their income from wages. So when wages rise, perhaps in light of rising productivity, that's good for everyone, but it is much, much better for higher income households than it is for lower income households. And that's not because lower income households don't work. They do, but wages still make up a smaller proportion of their income. And then the second reason is the cost of essentials will also tend to rise as the economy grows. So in particular, housing costs look like they're quite related to average income growth. And that means that if what you have is rising incomes, then you also have rising housing costs, and those housing costs make up a greater proportion of the costs of poorer households than richer households. So you can model all of this, and Joseph Rowntree have done some great work on it, we've done some work on it, and basically what you see is that a better economy, higher employment, higher wages, moves the average, but it tends to support higher income households more than lower income ones. You can also model policy changes, redistribution, and they will tend to show that you can't have much effect on the average through policy, but you can have a really, really big effect on the bottom, the incomes of poorer households. So, for example, in analysis not yet out, but I will give you a sneak preview, we've modelled what would happen to that bottom half of the income distribution if the government removed the limit on benefits for families with more than 2 children, but it also froze income tax thresholds and did a few other policies, and you can remove that bottom half being worse off that that I described earlier. So you can have quite substantial effects through the policy as well. I'm going to speed up, Paul, don't worry. My last one is higher growth or lower inequality. Are these sort of in conflict? And I think there's a risk that when we say higher growth can lead to higher inequality, we think we need to choose between growth and equality. But actually, what we need is both. We need both higher growth and lower inequality, and that is perfectly achievable. In the UK at the moment, we have the opposite. We have low growth and high inequality, and that creates huge structural challenges. At Resolution Foundation, we did a report called Economy 2030, and it has some really striking stats about how the UK compares to other countries and quite how stagnant these wages have been. If we think about the variation between places, for example, the richest local authority is Kensington and Chelsea. Average incomes there before housing costs are about £55,000. That might be slightly different now. It's a few years ago, but roughly. In Leicester, it was £12,300. So we have these huge geographical disparities. Housing costs play a big role in UK inequality as well, and perhaps with the spending review next week, I would particularly highlight that affordable homes per person have fallen by about 1/3 since the 1980s, and that is playing a huge part in the living standard story of lower income households. So growth is insufficient, but necessary is how I would describe it for improved living standards. We need to both aim for growth, and the government is right to do that, because the lack of growth has been a key driver in the stagnant living standards that have been experienced in the UK, certainly over the last decade and a bit longer. But it's not enough on its own. We will also need to think about both the structure of the economy and how we redistribute after that. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. The Guildhall feels a little bit like a church hall, so I'd like to do a reading to start this my bit off. But it is a secular space, so it's a reading from the Book of Schumacher that I want to read. Does anyone know who E.F. Schumacher was? Fantastic. For those of you who don't know, Fritz Schumacher was a German economist who came to the UK like I did as a Rhodes Scholar about 100 years ago, worked for the Coal Board for many decades, was a sort of labour economist, and he wrote many brilliant books, one of which I've been rereading recently called Small is Beautiful. He wrote it in the early 1970s. It had a huge impact on a whole bunch of economists. And in fact, it was the movement that he set off that led to the creation of the New Economics Foundation, where I work, which was founded in the 1980s, but inspired by many Schumacher supporters and followers. So in the book Small is Beautiful, Schumacher says, "The modern economy is propelled by a frenzy of greed and indulges in an orgy of envy. And these are not accidental features, but the very causes of its expansionist success. The question," he's writing this in 1973, "the question is whether such causes can be effective for long, or whether they carry within themselves the seeds of destruction." And Paul, you said that it feels like we're at a sort of momentous period, much like I suspect Joseph Rowntree himself would have felt a century ago. And I think we're at a momentous period in human history because we are seeing those seeds of destruction start to bear fruit. You mentioned the ecological crisis. I'm not going to talk about the impacts of our current economic system on nature, on our planet, on biodiversity. It's horrendous, scary, and there lies an obvious seed of destruction. Ruth's already talked a bit about another seed of destruction, which is the lack of social protection on offer for the world's poorest and marginalized, including in this country where we're seeing scarily poverty on the rise again, but also globally. More people were in need of humanitarian assistance in the last few years than in decades before. And global poverty, extreme poverty, an issue that I worked on a lot when I worked at Oxfam, thankfully was improving. We've had decades of progress, but much of that progress is being reversed at the moment. So what we do to protect those who are most vulnerable and poorest in our society is also, I believe, another seed of destruction. But I want to talk about two other seeds that I don't think we talk enough about, that I know Schumacher was concerned with, because he's talking about the orgy of envy and the frenzy of greed. And one is extreme wealth and what it risks doing to our society. And the second is the impact of that and the economic system that we have on democracy as we know it. So just briefly on each. So the sort of economic system as we know it, modern capitalism, is based on a few fundamental principles, one of which is trickle down. In fact, I have a fantastic joke about trickle down, but most of you wouldn't get it. Sorry. I think we've actually been conned into believing that the best way of organizing our economy this way is supposed to be about trickle down when it's actually about trickle up. And it's about trickle up because look at any statistic, pretty much anywhere in the world, about what's happening to wealth accumulation, and you'll see that we've designed an economic system that's incredibly good at allowing those who happen to own assets, own wealth, to get even richer. Let's look globally. When I was at Oxfam, we used to publish a report, an annual report at the time of Davos about wealth inequality around the world. And when that first report was published in 2014, the measure was that 64 people on the planet had more wealth than the poorest half of the world's population. That was in 2014. Every year, read that report, that number gets smaller. The second year, I think, was 30 odd. Then it became 20 odd. I think it was 6 at the last count. All men who own more wealth than the poorest half of the world's population. At what point do we think we have a problem? Is it when one man owns more wealth than the poorest half of the world's population? Let's look at what's happening in this country. Liam Byrne, Rachel's colleague, has a book out about wealth inequality in this country. And one of the statistics amongst many that he has in the book is about wealth inequality in this country just in the last 14 years. So he's looked at the period between 2010 and 2024 and found that if you happen to be in the top 1% of wealth holders in 2010, your average per capita wealth increased by £2.2 million over a 14-year period. And that's because if you happen to own property or shares or assets of any form, the returns that you got far exceeded the returns that those of us who work get. And of course, government after government fails to tax that wealth particularly effectively, and so through lower capital gains or all sorts of guises, that wealth increases 41 times more, that rate of accumulation of the top 1% than the average rate of wealth accumulation of the rest of the population, of the 99%. At what point do we think there's a problem in the way that we organize our society? Is it when we think over the next 14 years, if it's 82 times faster that the wealth of the 1% grows? At one point we must think that this is the seed of destruction that we have to address. Let me give you one more stat, which is the Sunday Times Rich List, which was published a couple of weeks ago, which, is a celebration, we're told, of entrepreneurship, of the underdog entrepreneur was one of the lines that was used in the press release for this year's Sunday Times. There's 350 of the richest households in this country, 2/3 of whom, by the way, we think, inherited their wealth. So these are not entrepreneurial underdogs. They're simply barons and other extremely rich people who've inherited their wealth. When that list was first published in 1989, to get into the list, you had to have about 6,000 times the average household wealth in the UK. This year, we think it's about 18,000 times to get into the rich list. Again, at what point do we think our economic system is problematic? Is it when it's 36,000 times the average wealth of it? And so wherever I look, at whatever scale, globally, nationally, we have a problem with wealth and we need to do something about it. And I hope that we see some political leadership of this government around taxing wealth effectively. There's some great signs. The G20, the group of 20 nations, last year in Brazil when it met, for the first time in its joint declaration said we need to do something about growing wealth inequality between and within countries, and they had at least a very high-level political commitment to a coordinated mechanism of taxing the super rich, the idea of putting a tax on billionaires, for example. So some progress that we see. The second thing I want to talk about is that this assumption that somehow growth, economic growth, or growth as we know it, will lead us all to be happier and better off is problematic for what it's doing to the climate, what it's doing in terms of leaving people behind, what it's doing in terms of wealth, but it's also problematic in terms of what it's doing to democracy. Because as Judge Brandeis, the American Supreme Court judge, said about 100 years ago in America at a time of rapidly increasing wealth inequality, he said, we have a choice. We can have democracy, or we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And I think there is a fundamental tension between an economic system that concentrates economic power in the hands of a few and a democratic system that's allegedly about equal voice and power for each of us. And I think we have, again, a problem. We have a problem because we have the world's richest man, until a couple of weeks ago when he fell out with Donald Trump, sitting alongside the President of the United States making decisions about what happens, including decisions that directly benefit the companies that he owns or controls. How do we tolerate in liberal democracies this idea that the rich and our political leaders can collude so publicly, so openly to make each of them richer? And even if we take what's happening at sort of democracy in a much more, in a broader sense, I fear that we are sleepwalking into a crisis of liberal democracy as we know it because of falling levels of trust in the system. 19 million of us chose not to vote in the last British general election. Add to that the numbers of people who voted begrudgingly for a party because in a first-past-the-post system they didn't have a choice they feel that they could really get behind. Add to that people who voted for the Reform UK because they dislike what mainstream parties have. And I think we have a crisis in terms of trust in our system. Or think about the statistic around trust in our elected officials. Now, Rachel is the exception, of course, but the Gallup organization has been polling in the UK for decades on the same question. So it gives us one of the rare examples of a historical comparison on trust in politics. And they've asked the question, do you think our elected representatives act in the national interest, their party's interest, or their own interest? And over the last 4 decades, the proportion of us who think that our elected officials act in the national interest has halved. It's fallen to only about 1/3. And the number of people, the proportion of people who think that they act in their own interest keeps rising. And that's because I think we have a system that's failing to look after those who are being left behind and seems to be lining the pockets of those who already have a lot. And I don't think it's particularly sustainable, and certainly the evidence around the world suggests it's not sustainable. And let me close with the sort of scariest of stat. The Open Society Foundation, another amazing progressive foundation, surveyed representative samples of people across the world in 30 different countries, very different countries, developed and developing, and asked people about their trust in democratic systems. They showed rather obviously that there were low and falling levels of trust, but more scarily, when people are asked, well, if you had a choice between a liberal democracy or an autocracy or a strongman leader, someone who could get things done without having to bother with elections, scarily large proportions of people, between 40 to 50% of people in many countries, said that they would prefer to have a strongman leader who didn't bother with democracy or elections because these don't make much difference anyway. And what was particularly scary was young people across almost all of those countries had higher levels of faith in autocracy than they have in democracy as we know it. So I think this idea that our economy, this notion of growth as we know it, is somehow going to deliver us better lives, more secure lives, and a healthy democracy, I think is incredibly fragile, and we really should do something to fix it. I'm going to make a plug for the book, if that's all right to finish. If you want to know how, I have written this book that Paul mentioned called Power to the People. I think it's on sale here, and it's got some ideas about how each of us needs to do our bit to challenging a political and economic system that is out of control. Thank you.
It's lovely to be on a panel with the New Economics Foundation and the Resolution Foundation. I used to work at the New Economics Foundation many years ago, and I'm on the advisory board of the Resolution Foundation, so these organizations I feel very close to, but also it's damned hard following these people, right? So forgive me and bear with me. Just to start with a bit of an international perspective, Paul mentioned I chair an organization called Our World in Data, and what that does is it plots the really long-run data trends over hundreds of years as to what's been going on across all sorts of topics, including poverty, climate change, etc. And I think it's really useful to kind of take that long view. And 200 years ago, probably 3/4 of people were living in absolute poverty around the world. These days, it's at about 10%. And growth has been an important reason why that has changed. Distribution really matters, but growth has really mattered in that story as well. So I think taking that kind of very long run view, we mustn't dismiss economic growth, but for the reasons that have been discussed, there's a lot more to it than that. A different set of statistics which I also wanted to pick on, and in a way I'm trying to fill gaps from what the picture that our previous speakers have already built up. In the UK, around 1 in 4 people are now living in poverty, and around 1 in 3 children. I mean, it's absolutely staggering, and you sort of wonder why these stats are not at the front of the newspapers every day. I sat on a commission, the Social Metrics Commission, which was looking at how we measure poverty, and we developed a kind of series of measures which actually there was a lot of support for, I think including from the JRF, on these kind of changes. And one of the key issues was we started measuring the needs of people alongside how much income they got, and current poverty measures don't do that very effectively. Having taken that into account, the key thing that we found was that disability is a really big driver, which is often overlooked in the current poverty stats. So over half of people in families in poverty are living in a family with a disabled person, as it were. So what you measure and how you measure it then really how you deal with poverty really flows from what you're measuring, as it were. So, and then coming back to the kind of question of work, 62% of people who are in poor families are in families where somebody is working. So the notion that actually it's the kind of feckless poor is completely untrue. And I've been sort of pleased to see actually that sort of story has died down a little bit in recent years. But that question of how you can make work pay and how do you build an economy where actually people have a fair opportunity, I think is really important. And that kind of notion of good jobs, in the old days, the UK used to have manufacturing. We built an economy more recently on services, and things like the financial services, for all their problems, were a source of some good jobs. There is a question, I think, of what are our areas of strength into the future, as it were. Another thing which I think we mustn't overlook is that growth, as well as being useful for the incomes that it gives us, it does pay for our public services. And so OECD averages suggest that public services are worth about 3/4 of the post-tax income of the poorest groups. So actually, public services benefit our worst off disproportionately, and without economic strength, it becomes harder politically. I mean, even if you may have the view that, well, government should be spending much more on public services, as you can see from the kind of unstable political coalitions that we're seeing and the fragmentation, you do need to build a kind of general support for that, as it were. So I think we mustn't overlook that kind of issue. Thinking about the current state of the UK, I mean, we've suffered from low productivity growth really since after the financial crash. So before that, it used to be about 2% a year. It's now been about 0.4% a year. And whilst everyone suffered, the OECD average went back up to about 0.9% a year. So the UK has actually been stagnant, and the Resolution Foundation, I think, has used that word. And wages haven't really grown very effectively, which is why people feel that considerable cost of living pressure. And there are kind of other sort of deeper trends as well. I mean, you can see the pressures on defence spend. We used to spend about 4.5% of GDP in the 90s on defence. That dropped to about 2% after the end of the Cold War. You can just see the pressure rising now to spend much more on that. Health costs are rising, and some argue that you probably need 3% growth on health costs beyond inflation every year now just to keep up with the kind of rising demand and costs. And there are kind of demographic challenges as well. So the number of over 65s back in 1991 was 16%, currently about 19%. By 2043, will be probably 24%. And on the flip side, the birth rate In 1964, you'd have an average of 2.93 births per woman. Now it's at 1.61. So that kind of imbalance, as it were, is sort of going to lead to be rising pressures on pensions, health, social care, but fewer workers to service that. So I think there are all these kind of structural issues. And if you think about tax, probably UK taxes were in the region of about 30% back in 97 when Tony Blair came in. They're now at about 36%. Some of you might think they could rise a bit further, but again, at what point does the public or voters push back against that? So I think one of the kind of reasons why growth is something that all politicians have latched onto is just that it's a magic wand out of some of these kind of pincer movements. So a 0.5% increase in recent OBR growth forecasts would have improved their forecasts overall by about another 30 billion. So that's one of the reasons why they really care about it. So what might we do to improve the economy, notwithstanding, Danny's critique about wealth and concentration, which might require a different set of improvements. You may get a government that wants to do that, you may not, but actually how do we improve the kind of ordinary economy for people? And we at the British Academy, with the National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, published a series of papers this week on economic strategy in the run-up to the spending review next week. I think there's a series of areas where this government has probably understood some issues. So investment in infrastructure, planning, transport, these are quite dull things, but they do really matter. But there is a kind of, making sure you have enough money now to be able to invest in those things is a tension, as it were, that you hopefully get a kind of virtuous cycle coming from that. Research and development is another area, science and research. But this government is pretty weak on universities. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if in the next 12 months we saw university collapse, and the impact on a local and regional kind of economy will be really, really powerful. Areas where I think the government probably could be thinking harder, a kind of much more holistic understanding of how the economy, the environment and society are interlinked. I mean, for example, they think of public services as something that is a cost, but actually if you improve public services, it also improves economic growth as well, so that the causation runs in both directions. Thinking about regional inequalities, the kind of levelling up rhetoric of the last government has very much been dropped, and I think that's a weakness. Really understanding the kind of nature of the economy we have. Whenever you see a politician talking about the economy, they're always on a construction site in a high-vis jacket. Actually, we're an 80% services economy. We're not Germany. Our creative industries are now 6% of the economy. They're bigger than life sciences, aeronautics, and automobiles combined. But would you ever understand that from the kind of conversations you have with politicians? So actually aligning with the sorts of strengths that we have as an economy is really, really important. And then coming back to kind of fundamentals around good jobs. So this is the kind of pre-distribution rather than redistribution. How do we make sure people actually have good lives? Childcare, thinking about the kind of the care economy as well, I think are some of the gaps that we need to start filling. But yeah, just to kind of end, growth does matter. But we need to focus on helping the worst off and kind of bearing it in mind and sort of structuring it in that way. We do have a weak starting point for our economy, and investing in our strengths and building our strengths, I think, is really important, especially in the kind of geopolitics we're now in and being out of Europe in the way that we are. Growth is not a great narrative. It's a kind of desiccated, kind of soulless concept. So I think bringing it back to people's lives and why people's lives matter, the notion of living standards, and therefore building a sense of solidarity so that it's not about helping the worst off who are over there. It's about how we collectively build a better society. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to defend the role of politics, but it's really great to be with you this morning. Obviously, next week we have got that great fiscal event setting the vision for the next 3 years. This will be Labour's agenda, setting out how Labour will manage the economy, our services, our country in the time to come. There is only one mission which is attached to that, and that is growth. And I'm going to make the argument why that is the wrong focus. And of course, it is constrained within 2 fiscal rules, and that is driving this government forward. And the problem we've got is that growth within itself, as we've already heard, it's gendered, it's ableist, it doesn't distribute itself into our country, and it doesn't social engineer. And therefore, it is a broken neoliberal experiment which has left gross inequality across our country as being its focus. And therefore, I want to talk about how do we ensure that we have control and look at power and where power sits in order to see a radically reformed economic approach, because the free market never delivers for the many, but just for the few. There are few obligations, but the cost is huge. And as we know from the work of Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, where we have got inequity, it costs our public services far more on every single social marker, whether it's around crime, health, education, housing, and of course, financial injustice and inequality. So I look at the economy as an extractive or investive process in which we can see where that money flows to. But the problem is, if you do not have tight regulation and controls over the economy, then people will extract. And we can see that here in the city, whether it's around housing, employment, or indeed our public services, as private companies have come in to take what they can out of the system. We see it even within the public services, a way the redistribution occurs. And first of all, if we look at the wage share in our country, and back in 1975, 50 years ago, 65% of a company's assets went to the workers. That has significantly fallen to the share, and with the share now going to shareholders and into profit. And as a result of that, we're seeing a redistribution of that wealth to the wrong places. It isn't the people that labour that get the benefit from that. And of course, amongst that, we see it incredibly gendered within that. If we look here in our city, the gender inequality, 22.6% today. That's higher than it was nearly 30 years ago. And as we look at what's happened in our public services, we've seen the mass outsourcing of services to profit, but also to extract out obligations around equal pay. We have seen in the academisation of the education system, chief executive salaries going up by tens of thousands of pounds a year, whilst the support staff who are doing the real work in the classroom have been placed on term time only contracts on minimum wages, and of course even dismissed. And as we can see, we are creating a poverty trap within our country. 14.5 million people today living in poverty. 1.2 million here in Yorkshire, 1.9 million older people, because we've got to look at that life course approach to this, predominantly women living in poverty, and as we've heard, 4.5 million children, 9,154 children in our city living today in poverty. And that is the disgrace of having a growth agenda driving everything forward. And of course, if we look at disabled people, 4.7 million across the country, and that's why the attack on disabled people in taking their lifeline, personal independence payments away is something that I've stood firmly against. We've heard about how those with the greatest wealth are able to accumulate more. And in the UK, the 50 richest families hold more than half the UK's wealth. And that just shows the gross inequality which has been developing in our countries. So we need to think about redistribution, we need to think about interventionism, and we need to think about redistribution. And I think particularly if we go back into redistribution, we know that we have got regional inequality, which is grotesque in our country, but also inequality around who holds the power to redistribute that. Just last week, we heard a big announcement by government on the defence industry. It was very interesting that the companies working in armaments were leaked the report or given the report ahead of the politicians, and companies like Babcock saw its share price increase by 7.8% the following day, yet we as politicians had no say over that agenda. So you can see how that wealth is being accumulated and extracted by those people who certainly don't then redistribute it back into the economy. And therefore, I want to make the case that, first of all, we need a complete different approach to how we handle the economy. I would tear it out of Westminster and put it in the hands of locality, because locally, you can then socially engineer the outcomes that you want to see for your own community. And you can invest it in the things that really matter. And I think the problem we have got with the harnessing of a centralised approach to our economy, more so than anywhere in Europe, it has resulted in us not being able to have effective transformation within the public space. Secondly, I would say that we need to see all of those commodities which really create equality in our society, bringing back into the hands of the public under democratic control, I would say regionally, not nationally, but things like our utilities, bringing that back into our control so that we are able then to redistribute. An example of this would be around winter fuel payments. The fact that we're looking to government to pay the winter fuel payments as opposed to the profiteering private companies shows how the government is being played by the private sector. So I do believe that we need to have a look at the responsibilities and obligations and where the power sits within that, because it's driving inequality as opposed to redressing inequality. But I would also say that one of the biggest challenges we've got today is housing. And when I look at the housing inequality from ownership to those people who depend on rental accommodation, not least in the private sector, we are seeing the exploitation and therefore the extraction of wealth from some of the poorest people altogether. I believe that the governments successively have failed in order not to control that wealth. And I am making the case that rent controls need to be back on the agenda again, so that we can put a lid on what is happening. And of course, yes, building the social housing that we need, not all of this assets and unaffordable housing and housing for short-term holiday lets and extraction, but we need to ensure that we get the investment. And of course, it was Nye Bevan who said only local municipal authorities can build the housing that a community needs. And that's why I would put the housing funding back into the hands of locality, alongside, of course, those other public services and utilities. But above all, as we've heard, and I would concur, is that we need to have a look at who holds the power and to shift that power. Because when I have looked at the things which have been most transformative here in our city, in healthcare, the Frailty Hub, amazing. It's utterly amazing. I would disagree that we need more money in our health service. We just need to put it in a different place. The Frailty Hub, supporting people in the last few years of life, is able to provide people the support and the pathways in order to manage their own health. But it costs far less because people locally are engineering it. If you look at some of the most greatest innovations around reducing crime and seeing people moving out from prison into the community, into a different trajectory in their lives, is the innovation of the voluntary sector, which has really brought that transformation. And yet it's held on a shoestring. But if you have that money locally, if that money has a purpose behind it for social engineering, then you can address the inequality. And when you address the inequality, then you obviously address the purpose of the economy. So next Wednesday, there will be lots of big announcements and lots of big numbers, but I don't believe it's going to shift the dial at all if it's held in the Treasury. It has got to be pushed out into locality to make the difference. And ultimately, politics does matter, because who are making those decisions will mean the kind of country and society that we have. And I would argue we need to go further. When I was just yesterday, I was at the local council talking about York's plan for 2032. And the discussion, I won't share the detail, it was under Chatham House rules. But the discussion was about producing a plan and then to share it with the people. And the point I made, and the point I make in politics, is whose plan is it? Whose city is it? Whose locality is it? Who is making the decisions? And unless we turn to co-production, unless we ensure that the diversity of voices, and needless to say, everybody was white and middle class sat around that table, unless we see the context of our population making the determination over the big choices, locally and nationally, we cannot expect to see a change. So the economy, on its trajectory as it has been in the neoliberal experiment, has failed us all, and it's failed us all so badly. And that's why we need a completely different approach. And I would argue, and it would be my contention, is that unless we build equality and purpose into the economy, it has no purpose at all.
Brilliant. There we go. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody, for amazing contributions. Huge amount for us to think over. I could quite happily and selfishly sit here now and ask 40 minutes worth of questions, so I will try and refrain from doing that. I did want to ask a couple of questions, but I will very soon come out to the audience, so please do think about what you would like to put to our panel. And just to forewarn the panel, because the Joseph Rowntree Foundation tries to deal in hope rather than despair, and you've filled us with despair. I will ask you for a little bit of hope towards the end, so I'll put you on notice that the final question you will get with me before we wrap up is just to give us some reasons to be hopeful and cheerful. And Danny, the answer cannot be buy my book. No! So one question is a slightly techie question, but and it's probably one that I want to put to Ruth, if that's all right. So Ruth, you talked about there is a relationship, it's contested, but there is a relationship between GDP and a strong economy and well-being, however you choose to define it. And actually, on the Diane Coyle book, I would encourage people to buy the Diane Coyle book. It is utterly depressing if you like stats. I mean, I went into the book thinking I don't really believe GDP is measuring the right thing, and I finished the book and I think not only is it not measuring the right thing, it's not even measuring that wrong thing. It's hopeless. 4/5 of GDP is basically not quite nonsense, but not far off. And Diane, who has spent a lifetime, there's a sentence in it which basically says, I've spent a lifetime studying the economy and realised we don't know anything about the economy. And yet we obsess about this GDP figure. But even if you accept there's a sort of relationship between growth, however measured, and well-being, one of the things I just want to ask about is which direction does that relationship go in? So the political narrative we usually hear is we need to get growth, and once we've got growth, we will be able to do lots of good things and provide more economic security, invest in our public services. It's a sort of jam tomorrow kind of thing, but it draws everyone back to let's get that GDP number up, and unless we do, we can't do anything. one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about at the Joseph Browntree Foundation is, well, what if the relationship is actually much more in the other direction? What if you can build more economic security at household level, and that creates the stronger economy that delivers growth? I know that Resolution Foundation done a lot of work on what is good work, and good work isn't something that just happens in the economy. You have to actually deliver good work, good jobs. We know that households which are living in poverty struggle to be productive. They struggle to get into work, and then people struggle to be productive in work because they have just this extraordinary trauma and burden of being in poverty. So if you can deliver household security, that in turn can deliver a stronger economy and growth.
So I think you're absolutely right, Paul, to ask about the nature of these relationships and to be careful not to think about them in one direction. I think, as you say, sometimes I find the government's message on growth sort of surprising, and bear in mind, most of what I spent the last 5 years at the Treasury doing was trying to get the books to balance, and yet even I find it surprising that the sort of the argument you hear is we need growth so that we can get tax revenues and we can afford to pay for stuff. And I find that a very odd reason to look for growth. I think the reason we want growth is because I do think that there is this relationship between growth and prosperity, and we should have growth because it does seem to be an important driver of higher living standards. And isn't that what we care about first, and sort of balancing the books second? So I think we can get the relationship confused the wrong way. Then there's the second point you make, Paul, which is we shouldn't sort of try and get the growth and then hope we can pay for a bit more better stuff for people. We have to engineer the growth to be the kind of growth, and basically this sometimes happens and it sometimes doesn't, that does deliver living standards for all. And I think the role of work in that, so just to say a bit about what the Resolution Foundation has done on that, the minimum wage has been a really important driver of reduced wage inequality, although average kind of hour wage inequality. We think that's been a good news story of the last period of time. But what we haven't seen so much progress on is job quality, and the measures of people's kind of job satisfaction have gone down quite significantly, and that is particularly true for low-income workers. So we've had some good action on wages that needs to keep going, but more action on job quality is really important, and I think some of the measures in the government's employment rights bill will help with that.
Brilliant. Does anybody else want to come in on that particular point? Heaton?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it sort of picks up a little bit on some of the things I was saying earlier. My slight worry is that there was and I would say 6 months ago, I was particularly worried about this. I feel slightly less worried now, but I almost felt there was such a loss of confidence in the government. They would do anything to get a short-term hit on growth, as it were. And you slightly got that sense from, they were just saying to companies, come over here and do whatever you need. I certainly got that when I was at the Keir Starmer speech where he was basically saying, we will inject AI into the veins of the nation. And I was like, I don't want to inject anything into my veins, So I think there was a slight kind of loss of confidence there. And you sort of think about, as you say, Ruth, it's about the kind of growth, the kind of economy we want to build. And if you want to change the nature of the economy in the way that panelists have been talking about, you may not get the immediate impact straight away, but that investment leads to a kind of better outcome. So a short-term hit is invest in London and the Treasury will tell you get a better return, but that's because all the transport links are already there. You've got the agglomeration effects, etc. If you want to build skills in regions outside of London and the southeast, investment in further education would do you really well, but we've seen budgets cut back in that space for many, many years. So it's about looking at what's the kind of economy you want to build, where are the investments that you'll make, There's a lot of people off on long-term sickness in the economy. One of the reasons is mental health. So what are we doing about that? Now, that will give you value, because if we don't write off whole swathes of people because of their education, their poverty or their health, and you bring them back into the economy, or women through childcare, etc., that will add to your prosperity, however you want to define it and whatever you see the purpose of the economy as being. But the worry is you end up on these kind of short-term fixes of, well, we've got the economy we have and we'll just lean into that a bit more.
What I would say is that the reason why we have this huge spend on our public services is because people are living in poverty. We know that if you experience poverty, that your health is far worse, and as a result we are having to invest far more in the reparation of that health or the maintenance of that health. However, if people are lifted out of poverty, they have better physical and mental health. So it pays to ensure that we get the inequality addressed, but likewise with the criminal justice system and likewise with education. And if we put money anywhere, I would say we invest it in education, because that is the biggest driver of social mobility, and that is where we can then build economic opportunity rather than just prosperity. So I think it's really important to think about how we make that investment in the right place, and that is about ensuring people are not placed in disadvantage. And of course, part of that is about having some control over your life, because if you live a life, and I spent a day with somebody in probation, and I just don't know how they live their life. This woman, it's like she had contact with her child, she had to go to the DWP, she just spent her whole day just trying to tick the boxes to get through to the next day. And what a massive waste of opportunity. So our system actually drives people deeper into dependency rather than to give people opportunity, and therefore to make those simple measures of lifting people out of poverty and giving them dignity is important. But I say this about Labour as well. What we have just seen with the public sector pay increases is really interesting. So the profession where there is most women in the NHS got the lowest pay increase, 3.6% as opposed to 4% in the other areas. And so it not only baked in greater gender disparity, but also it was a percentage increase. And of course, those people within the health service on the lowest wages are women. So we saw even a small increase in the actual take-home for those people on low wages, but of course the percentage increase always increases those people on the bigger salaries. So even those kind of measures is driving inequality as opposed to ensuring that you're lifting up people's opportunity at those people at the bottom of the scale.
I want to come back to the issue of power, if I can, because a number of you talked about that in different ways. And there's sort of two different elements to this. I'm just keen to sort of probe a little bit further. So one is actually around political power, which you talked about particularly, Rachel. So, I mean, it is true to say that in the UK, we live in probably the most centralised state in the Western world in terms of the amount of power that sits with central government ministers as opposed to more regional and local tiers of government. There's an argument to say that we don't really have local government in this country anymore, because about £7 in every 10 that your local council spends, it spends on social services, which are actually just basically the local delivery arm of nationally prescribed and inspected services. So there isn't really much local place shaping that can go on and discretionary work that goes on at a local level. And even within Whitehall, we operate I spent 20 years in Whitehall, it's an extraordinarily centralised system where the Treasury is all powerful, and the Treasury in the UK holds more powers than equivalent treasuries anywhere else in the world. So we are running an extraordinary experiment in the centralisation of government. The usual argument for doing that, which the Treasury would tend to, I don't know why I keep pointing at you, you've left the Treasury, I'm sorry. The Treasury would tend to say there are two benefits to that. One is you keep tight fiscal control, and the other is you avoid postcode lotteries and can ensure equality across the country. And it's worth knowing that we don't have tight fiscal control, as the Treasury keeps telling us we've run out of money. And secondly, we have the largest regional disparities in outcomes. So we're actually running an experiment which is delivering the opposite outcomes from the one that it claims to have. So it feels to me it is right that there is a growing political consensus about pushing power out. But then alongside the political power, there's a set of questions I think you're touching on more, Danny, which is about people's power within the economy and the power of capital and workers and wealth and power often going together. But can you just explore a bit more about that? And perhaps this is where we might start getting into what do we do to try and shift some of that?
Yeah, no, I definitely think there is a knotty problem that we can get out of it, to your point about hope. So part of it is, I think, we've come to assume that the sort of economy, which is supposed to, the way we organize our economic life should be in service of humanity, right? It should support and nurture human flourishing. But if almost every bit of policy making or mainstream media coverage of the economy has inversed it. It's almost as we are here to serve the economy. And that's why I think the fetishization of growth and aggregate GDP growth as the mission that trumps all other missions is not just a missed opportunity to show, I think, really effective political leadership, but I think it's dangerous. And there is and just on that, I was very hopeful when that plan for change was announced, which was the government's attempt to try to give a bit more nuance to the big missions, because it started to look finally at things like real net disposable household income as a measure of success, not just GDP per growth, but can we feel that growth but it didn't talk about distribution across households, nor necessarily across regions. And as Paul says, we live in one of the most sort of regionally unequal parts of the world. And my heart sank because just a few weeks after all of that, the government said it was going to back not one, not two, but 3 new airport runways in the southeast of England, which will undermine, which will level down even further because it will concentrate growth and economic activity in London and the southeast. So there is a problem there. But on power, it comes back to the sort of, I think, the bit that we're willfully neglecting is how the economy saps our own power and agency. We talk a lot, and government talks a lot about working people, as if that is sort of the be-all and end-all. I think Rachel's made the point very well. The quality of work that more and more of us have is leaving us feeling insecure. It's part of a gig economy that was supposed to emancipate and give us more control, but actually is leaving us more isolated, more vulnerable. And then, of course, the problem is those so-called people who are non-working, if you happen to be out of work because you're disabled, then you're being punished by all sorts of cuts. And as I was trying to say earlier, if you happen to be well off enough that you don't have to work and you can just sit back and collect the benefits of your assets, you're not working, but you're getting much better off than the rest of society. And so I think there is something about, and here's the missed opportunity. I don't think it's too late for a government such as this to say, actually, hold on, we made a mistake. It's not about growth, it's about well-being, or it's about happiness, or it's about human flourishing. And that's what this project is about. And we're going to measure our success on that. And if you think that's crazy, have a look at what Nicola Sturgeon was trying to do in Scotland, or what Jacinda Ardern was trying to do in New Zealand, or what the government of Bhutan is trying to do about gross happiness, national happiness. There are lots of other political experiments, none perfect, none ambitious, maybe not entirely applicable to the UK scale, but I think there is an open goal for Keir Starmer if he wants to redefine what economic success really looks like.
Anyone else want to come in on this? Or we can go to the audience. Hitan.
I'm riffing off this a little bit, so it's not in a sort of direct response, but I think one of the things that I'm grappling, you can sense there's a kind of consensus on the panel. There's differing kind of desires about how far you go, etc., but there's definitely a sense of let's have an economy that works for all people is the kind of uniting theme here. I think the question that sort of keeps me up at night is, and you look at the rise of populism around the world and the far right in Europe, we're a declining mid-size economy in a growingly unstable world. And those are some of the kind of constraints within which we're operating, as it were. And in some ways, I can sort of say, we've all talked about the lack of confidence amongst politicians at the kind of highest levels, but I can understand some of that. And what is the actual operating license that they've got, and what difference can they make? And I'm not answering that question, but I sense there perhaps are different views underlying the panel's optimism or pessimism, depending slightly upon that.
Okay, this is your turn now. I'm going to come out to the audience. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience. Just as a reminder, we are very interested in your views. We are even more interested in your question. So try and make sure whatever you do has a question mark at the end to our panel. I'm going to go right to the back to start off with. Please wait until the microphone, sorry, I've gone the furthest possible distance away from the microphone. If you just wait a moment, we'll get the microphone to you, and we'll then work our way forward, I guess.
This working? Hi there. Lovely to be here today. I'm actually part of the Joseph Rowntree funded Collective Imagination Community of Practice. So you talked a bit earlier about Joseph Rowntree funding hope. There's lots of things we could talk about how dire things are, how dire they are likely going to be. But sort of breaking out of the tyranny of the possible, for all of you and maybe for the audience to think about, what are the kind of utopian things, or at least things that you dream of, that you hope for? Because there are a lot of tools thinking about collective imagination, just plugging our own website, that might be able to those into being, or at least get us thinking about them and dreaming about them. So yeah, what are your kind of utopian dreams for the future?
This is the moment, guys. You've got to be hopeful now.
I'll start because hope gets me up every single day, and yes, incredibly challenged. But I think there's several things that I would say. First of all, we have got to look at our planet as a whole. We are interconnected across our planet, and therefore we have got the opportunity to control 1.5. We have got the opportunity to save our climate, and we have that power to make that difference. So that's the most important thing, that we actually have a planet in the future. And I think we have to think global, because if we look, we've talked about inequality locally. You know, people in our city, if you live in Clifton, you're more likely to die, Human Rights City report, 13 years earlier than you will in the most affluent part of our city. So we've got gross inequality here. We've got gross national inequality, and we've really focused on that. But globally, we've got gross inequality at scale and pacing as well. But we can address some of that. And I think, for me, the hope in politics is about leadership, and leadership in a relational mechanism as opposed to a transactional mechanism. And I think that is really achievable, that we actually step onto the world stage as a country which wants to invest in our planet and our people. And certainly, you know, I think about the discourse this week on defence, and I'm very focused on that. But defence without diplomacy and development doesn't achieve anything. And I think if we think about how we're going to get stability on our planet, which will then bring stability at home, we've got to think about how we make those right choices and investments. So I think we've got to think globally, act locally, nice phrase, you're often used, know where our allies sit, and to be ambitious. And I think the thing about politics across the world, it's incredibly timid. And I think there is a lot more agency that we can use. The second thing I will say, I won't talk for the next hour, but the second thing I would say is my hope is in you and also the generations to come. Because the problem we've had for too long is that people have relinquished their power. And whilst we talk about power being taken, and it is at scale, but we give up our power too easily. And I would just say, we all have power, we all have equal power, but we need to hold on to it and nurture it and look after it well, and to use it efficiently, because your power can make a real difference. And I think the power that young people have will make a tremendous difference. But the thing is, we neglect it and we set it aside. I look at myself in Parliament at the moment, and I'm not in the cabinet, I'm not a minister, I'm not a chair of a select committee, I didn't even get on a select committee, I'm not even the monitor of paperclips. And yet I have got platforms which are shifting the government agenda. So think about the power that you have and use it well and use it constructively and never give it away.
I love the idea of that sort of reimagining or the crisis in imagination, which I think this is also what it's about. And for me, the reason I'm hopeful is because my definition of hope is knowing that things can change. So I'm not an optimist, which I define as someone who believes things will change. I know things can change. We don't have to organize our economies or our societies or our political systems in the way that we currently have. And in fact, if you just look at any bit of history, you'll see humans have organized things radically differently in the past. And the two reasons I know things can change is there are plenty of examples, real-world examples. You don't have to look for a future utopia to find different ways of doing things. Look at the cooperative movement. 3% of British GDP today is already accounted for by cooperatives and mutuals. So scaling those mechanisms up would not only give us the sort of economic dynamism we need, but a greater sense of control and ownership for every one of us. So or think of the way that we can create, modernize and reimagine democracy itself. Let's replace the House of Lords with a House of the People, selected by sortition, an upper house that's truly democratic. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can evolve power. And the second reason, I've worked in civil society for all of my career, and therefore I've had the privilege of working with some amazing, brave leaders. And this is to Rachel's point, that history has, the transformative moments of human history, in my view, were almost always driven by small numbers of principled people determined to make change. That's how we got the end of segregation in the US, or the end of apartheid in South Africa, or the international treaty on banning landmines. Look at any one of those examples, and it starts with a small group of people determined to make change happen, and that's what we need more of.
Okay, I'll move us on because I want to take another question. Just picking up this point about imagination ideas, it's always worth remembering that we are the prisoners of whatever ideas are prevalent at the time. Like we've mentioned Diane Cole's book a number of times now. There's a sentence in it where she just reminds us GDP is not a thing, it is an idea. And then we can come up with a different idea as to how we measure our economy. We are prisoners of ideas until we change them, and we often change them through local experimentation. We are here to honour the legacy of Joseph Rowntree. He was considered a maverick. He was thinking the unthinkable, and he was getting on with doing it. And that is the sort of spirit we are looking to encourage through the work we do at JRF and through many of the other organisations you see here. I think we're going to have time for just one more question. I'm going to go here, sorry, right at the front. Could you just wait for the microphone?
Thank you. For those who advocate growth, I'm going to guess that you would have advocated for the very same thing 30 years ago, for instance. And if you live long enough, I assume you'll be advocating for the very same thing in 100 years. So does growth have an objective, and when will it be achieved?
Does growth have an objective? When will it be achieved?
Shall I pick that up? Because I was being positive about growth. Growth doesn't have an objective, and I was trying to say why. I started off probably more sceptical about growth. When I was at NEF, I led the work on well-being back in the early 2000s, and was far less interested in growth. And it's over the last 20 years, as we've had less of it, and I've seen some of the problems that it's created. I was trying to make the case for partly why my own views have shifted, as it were. So. Growth in of itself doesn't matter, but it does seem to help with all sorts of other things, as it were. But you can do it in better and worse ways, and the kind of environmental constraint very much plays on my mind. And just to kind of touch on, I might briefly answer the previous question about imagination. I wrote a piece in the New Statesman a few months back called "Why Tony Blair is Wrong About AI." So I'm quite an AI skeptic, but if you want me to be utopian, given we're about to see an enormous amount of technological change, the idea that we could use AI for actual common good purposes, I think would be really radical but very difficult to pull off. But you've asked me to be utopian, so there you go.
And just to add to that, I think, I mean, very much agree. And growth is not an objective, but it is, I think, necessary for continually rising prosperity for all. And so you could say, you know, we've reached a point where we don't want that anymore, but I don't think that we have. And I think, you know, it was very striking, Heaton, the facts about when you look at the long run, what we've seen, and I would like to go further, and I suspect you're right that in 30 years I'll still want to go further again. But the important point is it's not growth for its own sake, it is growth as a driver of better living standards. And then again, to link it to the previous question, I guess to be horribly pragmatic amongst the panel, the reason I'm hopeful is because actually I don't think this is a utopian dream. I see lots of areas where the things that are within the power of this government and others to change would make a really big difference, and areas where actually what we're talking about is kind of levelling up, either the UK to other countries or bits of the UK to other bits. So on affordable housing, the government's said it wants to build 1.5 million homes. If 400,000 of those are affordable homes, then we'll be back to 2010 levels of affordable housing. Now, I would like to go further than that, but I think that would make a big difference, and I think that's perfectly achievable. When we think about good work and employment, one thing the government's been surprisingly quiet about is it does have an ambition to reach 80% employment. That's quite an ambitious goal, which is perhaps why they've been quiet about it. But when you model the effect that that would have on living standards, it is actually, compared to some of the policies that are very expensive, a very significant driver of higher living standards. And if we can accompany that with good, rewarding work, I think it would make a big difference. And there are areas of the country where we do see that level of employment. So it's not an impossible dream. It is something that could be achieved.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, I think we've actually got time for one more to look at Joan. I think we can squeeze in one more question. I'm going to go there just because the hand was up a bit earlier on. So just, can you keep your hand up, sir, just so that we can get the microphone to you, and then we'll take this to the final question. So panellists, see this as an opportunity. Try to answer the question, but if you can't, just say something inspiring to see us out.
It does seem to us sitting on the floor here that if we want redistribution, the sensible thing is to tax the rich. The government always says, oh, we can't do that because it'll drive them overseas. I think some of us would be quite happy to see them go overseas. It would take enormous pressure off the top end of the housing market, and that would trickle down to right through the housing market. What does the team think?
Great, so question about tax, and can I just add a bit of flavour to that, because I want to bring in this sort of question about wealth versus income. So one of the things about our economy is it works very well for owners and not so very well for earners, and the tax system reinforces that. So I think you were alluding to a question about wealth taxes, but you know, good to focus on the wealth aspect alongside earning it too. Danny.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree with you more. That we've been doing some work on extreme wealth, and one of the arguments we get almost always from everyone is, oh, if you do too much to curb wealth, you know, to add wealth taxes, people will just leave. What's curious about the Sunday Times Rich List that was published a couple of weeks ago is the single biggest riser over the last year are two Russian brothers who've made their money on computer games, who actually became British citizens in the last 12 months. So we don't get told the story that actually Britain is still a very attractive place for a lot of ultra-rich people from all around the world. So I would like to look at the evidence about whether these people really are leaving in droves. And as you say, even if they did, perhaps we would be better off rather than where we are. But on your hopeful sort of element, you know, one of the things we're working on is the notion of an extreme wealth line. So lots of countries, every country pretty much, has an extreme poverty line, the line below which we think no person in our society should have to live. It's a sort of below survival. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has gone one better and has the minimum income standard that you've sponsored, which is to say, well, how do you know, what do you need to live a decent, dignified life in society? I'd say we also need an extreme wealth line, where we say, look, if we're a civilized species, we recognize that there also needs to be guardrails on how much you can accumulate, because above a certain point it becomes dangerous for democracy, dangerous for the environment, dangerous to the social fabric. And we would like to have a sort of proper national conversation about that. And the good news is, when the early research that we've done suggests most people think that's a very sensible idea. And then it's up to policymakers what they do above that. They could put in very high tax rates, or they could ban inheritances above that line, so that no person could inherit more than £10 million or whatever the line ends up being. So there's a relatively simple idea in your sort of pantheon of ideas that shape society that could really liberate us from being slave to this notion that wealth accumulation is somehow inherently and always good.
I think that point about the line sounds really interesting, because I think one of the tricky things about the tax the rich debate is we all have different ideas about who's rich, and within it there are two slightly different proposals. One is to tax extreme wealth, which sounds like the line, and which there might be social reasons to want to do, but which it doesn't raise the sort of level of revenue that allows you to completely shift public services. And that doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but I think we have to be honest about that. There's a different tax the rich, which is tax people with above average income and redistribute it more to people on lower than average income, or have a kind of shift in the level of public service provision. One of the intriguing challenges about that is that people tend to think that the rich are the people richer than them. And there's some quite interesting kind of polling evidence. If you ask people who's rich, it's something like kind of 86% of people think if you earn less than, if you earn more than 250 grand, you're rich. Now that means there's 14% of people who don't think you're rich if you earn more than £250,000 a year. So this question of where we draw the line, I think is really important to answering whether you tax the rich. And there's a kind of political debate that we're not really having at the moment, which is for the level of public service provision do we think the average person should pay more tax or not, and that is the biggest driver of that is, as was referenced earlier, how much you want to spend on the health service and the kind of health service you want to have.
Thank you. Heaton.
I hesitate to go here, because who are the people who might be out on a Friday morning for a panel like this? But there's a slight intergenerational issue here as well, I think. I mean, there's a lot of people who are often retired, wholly homeowners. There's the term that the editor of The Spectator coined for it, the assetocracy in the UK. Now, they are leading, perhaps you are leading, quite different lives from younger generations who are finding it incredibly hard to get on the housing ladder, et cetera, et cetera. Now, much of the assetocracy, I think this has been when we've looked at the sort of left behind discourse, who voted for Brexit, et cetera, there's been quite a strong focus on people who were left behind. Actually, there was quite a bit of assetocracy who also were quite pro all of that as well. And there's an alignment. I suspect in York it's a slightly different dynamic, but an alignment of a kind of set of people who don't want more houses built, don't like immigration, and actually don't want the sorts of things that bring growth. So I think there's quite a weird dynamic in certainly the UK economy, and it may be spreading into other places as well, that economic interests across generations are not necessarily well aligned. And coming back, I think Ruth absolutely has it on the nail, that there may be good reasons for taxing the ultra-rich because actually you think they're a democratic threat, but it's not going to be a huge economy-changing revenue raiser. If you want to do wealth taxes, you have to look further down the scale. It will probably start biting people in the room, but there may be reasons why actually we're now on such different tracks in terms of what the economy means for us. We need to think about that.
My question would be, is the finance director doing anything more valuable, say, than the woman who is a care worker, and yet look at the wage differential you see there? I think we've got to start talking about enough, because for everybody that benefits from growth, there will be somebody that loses from growth as well. And if we are going to try and create a more equitable world over a life course, we've got to close that differential and also look at what we are valuing. And for far too long, the thing that we have valued has been our own personal wealth, our benefit, and we have used that to then exploit the environment for our benefit as opposed to the collective benefit. So just a thought, supposing all wages were the same, supposing all could earn equally, supposing all had a home, a health service, an opportunity of education, what a better society we would live in.
So I had one job, which was basically to bring this in on time, and I have failed. We've gone slightly over, but hopefully the growth of the length of this session has contributed to your collective well-being. So just showing that well-being and growth can indeed go hand in hand. I'm very pleased that the festival's independent bookseller, Fox Lane Books, are here, which means I think you can buy a copy of Danny's book. I would recommend it. It is excellent. He might even sign it if you're lucky, which will up its resale value. So that's excellent. If you like a free festival in York, and you clearly do because you're at one, can I also encourage you to find out a bit about the JRF's own festival that we'll be holding this summer on the 5th and 6th of July at Homestead Park. It is called Here is Hope. So here is despair, and at Homestead Park there is hope. It'll be a mixture of music, performance workshops, opportunities for play alongside provocations and games, something for everyone in the family. So bring children, grandchildren, friends, cousins, relatives, just bring everybody along. The sun is guaranteed to shine. The good news is it is absolutely free. So this is a gift from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to the people of York in our to mark the 100 years since Joseph's death. It's basically recreating a tradition from many years ago when there was a much-loved family carnival in Homestead Park, which was a gift from Seabourn Rowntree to the city. So we will be looking to recreate that. You can find out more information about it at the table at the back from my JRF colleagues. We have run slightly over. Our next session will start promptly at 1 o'clock. I encourage you to attend. Rachel mentioned the work of Kate Pickett earlier on being groundbreaking. Kate will be on our panel at 1 o'clock. So do grab yourself a cup of coffee or tea. Please rejoin us in about 25 minutes, and I look forward to seeing you then. And before you go, just one final big thank you for our amazing panelists who've joined us.